I left last week's worship feeling so wonderful. You might remember that 2 weeks ago when I preached, I started off by complaining because I had felt like I had preached the same theme over and over and over. Paul's central theme in the letter to the church at Colossae, the centrality and supremacy of Christ, over and over and over. And then last week, I got a break. Last week, you recall, we talked about rigid religion, how it can zap the life out of the life of grace. If we worry too much about the rules, what's okay to eat or drink or wear, it can be distracting. We talked about the liberating life of faith. It was great. We heard the men's choir sing. We saw London be baptized into the faith. It was just wonderful. And then I got to today's message, and all of the wind went out of me. I read the hard, indicting words and so wished I could go back to preaching the centrality and supremacy of Christ that I complained about 2 weeks ago. Today's message is hard. The impact is not unlike Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Remember, Jesus is going through the countryside, breaking lots of rules in the religious tradition. He heals on the Sabbath. His disciples pick grain on the Sabbath. The religiously rigid of his day were furious because they wanted him to keep the rules. In fact, they were counting how many steps you could take on the Sabbath before it was called work. I mean, you got to get enough steps to get to the bathroom and back, to the table and back. But too many steps, you might as well just be in the field working. Really religiously rigid. But now, Jesus reacts to that legalism, and the disciples start to recline in the glory of the fact that they're not bound by all of these tight religious rules. And then Jesus abruptly adjusts their expectations. You have heard it was said, but I say unto you. You've heard it was said, thou shalt not murder, but I tell you, you shouldn't even hate anybody that much. You've heard it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery, and I tell you, don't even look at women that way. So Jesus is not lowering the expectations when he frees us from the law. He ratchets it up. And Paul is doing the same thing here. Before I read the hard words in this text, I need to warn you. Paul's words will indict you if you listen too closely. If you really listen, you will squirm a little bit in your seat. Now, we could avoid this. I could chase the scholarly debates, and we could keep this at distance and keep it from getting at all in our stuff. I mean, for instance, I could talk about the commentaries and did Colossians have a problem in this particular area? Was Paul being corrective or preventative? See, I could talk a lot about what was happening in that church, in that context, in that day, and just keep us at a little distance from it. For instance, some of the commentaries suggested that some in that church, that first century church, were having problems with inappropriate, intimate relationships within that church. And we could chase what was going on in that church, or maybe the counter argument to what they thought was going on in that church. And I confess it's tempting, because if we read it with us in the story, if we are the focus of this text, it's going to get uncomfortable. I don't like the implications of this. Sermons are much easier to hear if we talk about them and not us. Let me say something else before we get to the hard stuff about talking about us. One of the great privileges of pastoral ministry is that I hear some of your secrets. When I preach a sermon like this, some of you might think I'm looking right at you and betraying your secrets. And you see how quickly I'm darting all over the room not to look at anybody. Because I would not betray your secrets. I would not tell your stories. But I'm one of the few people in the room who knows that everyone sitting here is keeping secrets. I have the privilege of knowing some of them, but the ones that matter most are the ones you know. The indicting part of the letter I'm about to read implicated everybody in the first century church when it was read, and it will implicate us too because they had secrets and we have secrets. Paul is addressing their sin and ours. I know this is a lot of setup, but I've got 2 more warnings before we read it. 2 more. 1, each of us is guilty. Remember, Paul says clearly, in these you once walked when you lived in them, and we have all lived in them. But just because everybody's guilty, we can't grade ourselves on the curve and say, well, nobody's perfect. Because Paul also says, on account of these, the wrath of God is coming. Whenever we make people into objects, God is angry. So are you ready? This is the list. These are the offenses that are as ancient as a first century house church in Colossae and are as recent as your current internet search history. Listen if you dare. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness. That's wanting other people's stuff, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you once walked when you lived in them, but now put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and foul talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old nature with its practices. If we had ears to hear, the best sermon might be for me to read that same list over and over for 20 minutes till we felt the 50 shades of shame and wanted to be made new. Do you see? The Gnostics were saying that the body's evil and we should deprive the body and we should self-mutilate and all of that. And Paul let us off the hook. Paul says that's ridiculous. And then just when we thought we had a hall pass, Paul says it's tougher than that. Here's what I want you to do with the physical world you inhabit. Put away fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness. The worship of any appetite is another way that we put something other than Jesus at the center of our life. And we all worship something. We all have a God. This might surprise you. I have 2 newspaper angels in this church. One of them will not surprise you as an angel. One of them is Edie Whitaker. She's a newspaper angel. What I mean is, whenever she sees something in the local newspaper that has anything to do with somebody at Second-Ponce, she cuts it out, leaves me a note, and puts it in my box. The other angel will surprise you. It's Jerry Goldsmith. Jerry has not been called an angel before in church, I don't think. He cuts out articles from the Wall Street Journal that touch on religious issues and leaves them in my box. A few weeks ago, he cut out an article and left it with me about the popular pastor in New York City, Tim Keller, who's pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church there. It was an interview, a weekend interview with Mr. Keller. And he said the same thing in that interview that I want to read. He said that we all worship some God, some appetite. And here's what he said. Everyone has a God. Everyone has a way of salvation. We just don't use the term, he says. St. Augustine would say, what makes you what you really are is what you love the most. Mr. Keller adds that he likes to show secular people that they're not quite as unreligious as they think. They're putting their hopes in something and they're living for it. For ambitious, driven New Yorkers, it is often a career, he says. I try to tell people the only reason you're laying yourself out like this is because you're not really just working. This is very much your religion. Some of us worship the appetite of accumulation and success and getting more than other people get. Covetousness is the biblical word, wanting what other people have. For some, that appetite is so strong that it becomes like an unhealthy religious pursuit, and relationships become a way of getting what I want. The other appetite that destroys is the pursuit of physical pleasure that treats people like objects. It's another satisfaction of appetite that uses relationships as a way to get what I want. And we are all guilty. Paul says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. Fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. So is there any hope? Paul says yes. Paul says, put this on. If you want to live a different way, a more hopeful way, change your clothes. Take off what you've been wearing and put this on instead. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassion, kindness, lowliness, meekness, patience, forbearing one another. If someone has a complaint against you, forgiving one another. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. And above all things, put on love. This is about as straightforward as it gets, and I wish I could put the medicine in Jell-O so it would taste better and go down easier. But Paul is just ruthless on this one. If you are pursuing relationships for your own gain and pleasure, if you are treating people like things and things like treasures, you need to stop. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. Now, you know by now that my image of God is one of creative goodness. You know by now that I am motivated to this work because I have experienced so much of God's grace and provision and unyielding love. And you know by now that I love nothing more than to stand at this sacred desk and preach the wide expanse of God's grace. But some texts just indict us. And we've got to stand together under the terrible nearness of God and hear the hard words. But we know that one movement of God's love is to be like a loving parent. A loving parent who sees a child running toward an open fire will yell at the child because the loving parent knows that if the child gets too close to an open fire, that child will be hurt. God's love yells stop if we're doing destructive things. And Paul is not playing around here either. You are running into fire, and Paul is sternly yelling at us to stop. Stop treating others as a means of satisfying your appetites. But, he says, there is another way. Take that outfit off. Put this one on. Compassion, kindness, lowliness, meekness, patience, forbearing, forgiving. Put those on. And interestingly, the very personal work of renewal is also the work of community. We do this together. We pray for each other. We hold each other accountable. We help each other assemble new outfits with new accessories of compassion and kindness, forbearance and forgiveness. Now, it's hard to see in the English, but a lot of the pronouns in today's scripture are in the plural. You put to death. You must get rid of all such things. You do not lie. The Greek there is plural. So translated into standard proper Southern English, it's y'all. Y'all help each other get dressed. Y'all keep each other away from destructive places and eroding habits. Y'all come together to read and study and sing and worship. Y'all join the church today. Get involved in Sunday school. Study, push, ask, pray. Y'all develop soul friendships in this place. People you can trust with the unfinished parts. Y'all hear each other's confessions, and y'all help each other rebuild. This is the work of the church. Y'all help each other get dressed. Abundant living is on the other side. Would you stand and sing and respond?